Awesome. Okay. So a couple announcements. There's this kind of cool thing going on. It's called the Climate Teach-In on the 20th of October. It's a kind of neat opportunity. See the Sustainability Office on campus. So this is October the 20th. So let's see, that's a Tuesday, right? So Tuesday from 12 to 1 p.m., you guys, you have a real special opportunity to learn about climate scientists, to learn about climate science from experts on campus. So from 12 to 12:20, Chris Hennon in the Atmospheric Science Department, Jen Rohde-Ward in the Biology Department, and then Evan Kuzo in the Education and Environmental Studies Department are going to be talking about some basic climate science, then talking about some climate impacts and adaptations, some community presenters there, and then climate solutions from 12:40 to 1. This is going to be like rapid fire. These people are going to have like 6 or 7 minutes. It's going to be like boom, 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 boom. Pretty short presentations. And the final one, Kathleen Lawler, who's in the economics department, is going to talk about pricing carbon, some market-based approaches at helping solve climate change. And then Kelsey Hall, who's one of our students, one of our environmental studies students here at UNCA, and then Lindsay, I don't know how it's pronounced, Nystrom, I guess, at the National Environmental Monitoring and Analysis Center. They're going to talk about planning for climate resilience. And Kelsey is really involved in the divestment movement here at UNCA, which is trying to get our money invested in clean investments, not investments that are very carbon intensive. And there's been some real good negotiations going on there. So some cool things going on there. So this is another extra credit opportunity. So, so like the other ones, if you'll go ahead and email me a summary of that program, get 10 points of extra credit. However, you are supposed to register in advance for this. And so I think you all probably got an email about this, but if you didn't, you can just Google UNC Asheville Office of Sustainability and find your way to it that way. So go ahead and do that, and then you get 10 points extra credit. Just a reminder, a midterm celebration. I thought I needed more interesting presentations to our celebration. So you guys are going to be like this person who won the spelling bee. You're like, yeah, it's awesome, it's a celebration, but you're going to be just as mellow and chill as he is because you're prepared, you've studied well, you're going to do well. So, on the horizon. Okay, so last time we were talking about freshwater resources, and one of the things we discussed was how human activity has altered the water cycle. And one of the ways that it's done that, of course, is that by paving over land surface, we're increasing surface runoff, and we have less water going down into the ground. And it's funny, my stream ecology class, we did an experiment in Sweeten Creek and Bee Tree Creek out in the Swannanoa area. And we collected samples of the water from the two. And what we found in this urban creek, this creek in the middle of Asheville, we found lots and lots of sediment in the water from erosion that's been happening. Because it's an urban stream, and we have all this surface runoff that's coming over and creating some problems. So, so human activity has certainly affected the water cycle. I was going to go into more detail. We're running a little late, though. I found this interesting story. There were these researchers doing work to try and track these eagles. So they do this kind of interesting thing. They fit them with these little devices that they kind of strap to their backs. And then when these eagles go by cell phone towers, it pings on the tower, and so it helps the researchers locate where they are. So this is a project going on in Russia. And these eagles flew a lot farther than they had expected, actually into Iran. And these researchers, the cell phone plan they had for this project did not include Iran, so they had to pay these outrageous roaming charges because these eagles flew into places that weren't covered by their cell phone plan, sent a lot of messages, and so they, like essentially the budget for the study was getting bankrupted because these eagles were flying too far away. But there's a happy ending to the story because the cell phone provider decided to just give them the data for free. So that was nice. It's causing trouble. It's probably a young eagle running up the cell phone bill, I would guess. Maybe an adolescent eagle in all likelihood. Perhaps like to go on Twitter. So I've got another fish joke for you. What do you call a fake koi fish? You know this. You guys know this. What do you call a fake koi fish? A toy fish? I like that. I like that. I mean, that's not what they called it, but we could call it that. A decoy, you guys. A decoy. All right. I'm just going to assume you all are smiling, even though I can't see your faces. All right. Anywho, so we're going to talk today about environmental health and toxicology. And you don't need to write all this down, but I just wanted to kind of share results of this study. People say, like, you know, why do we need the environment? And so we talked the other day in our biodiversity discussion about how, like, there are those who, you know, claim that we have sort of like a spiritual and mental connection to nature. So in this study, they looked at over 3,000 participants that answered a questionnaire about their commuting habits and their mental health. And the study found that folks that were commuting through natural environments daily had a significantly higher mental health score than those who didn't commute through natural environments. So I think it's interesting, you know, in stressful times like now, thinking about what is it that helps relieve stress is an important thing, right? And this is a study that showed that spending more time in nature significantly improved folks' mental health. And the effect was even stronger among folks who were moving actively through those areas, so either walking or cycling. So when you're feeling really stressed, go for a walk in the woods, or go down. Anybody who's been down to the botanical gardens? Anybody been down there yet? Cool. Well, go down there for a walk if you're feeling stressed. It will improve your mental health based on results of this study. So there's this idea, right, that the environment is a beautiful place. It's a nice place for us to be connected with. But it can be dangerous too. And in a lot of ways, it's most dangerous where we've altered it, right? So I shared the example of Love Canal in Niagara Falls, I think back at the beginning of class, a place that was polluted with industrial chemicals and led to significant health risks for the residents, increased rates of cancer, birth defects, and things like that. So environmental toxicology it's kind of how the environmental movement started, to be honest. And it kind of came along when we realized that we were doing things to the environment that made it dangerous, made it not a safe place to be. And so environmental toxicology in general is we're studying the effects of some of these harmful agents on living organisms. And so these can be chemical agents, like the chemicals that were stored at the Love Canal site. They can be physical agents. These can be things like hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, landslides. They can be physical events like that. Or they can be biological threats as well. And of course, we don't need to come up with any examples of that in today's world, right, of some of these biological agents. But another example is mosquitoes. You know, as the climate has been warming, it's allowed mosquitoes, tropical mosquitoes, to move and expand their ranges into areas to the north and higher elevations that used to be too cold for them. And as they've expanded their range, they've brought malaria with them. And so, when I was in the Peace Corps in Nepal, we would take a little pill daily that protected us from malaria. Because when you're below a certain elevation, you can get malaria. But volunteers that were posted up in the hills of Nepal didn't have to worry because it was too cold for the mosquitoes that carry the malaria parasite. Well, studies have shown that those mosquitoes are able to move slowly up to higher and higher elevations as the climate's been warming. So all of these are parts of environmental toxicology. So just to give a couple examples of some chemical contaminants in the environment. We talked about PCBs already, of course, with salmon as a chemical that's used in several manufacturing processes like paper, insulation for electrical wires, or a couple of them, right? And this is a carcinogen. Now, what does it mean if something's a carcinogen? Yeah. Say it again? Yeah, causes cancer. It's known to cause cancer, right? So PCB is known to cause cancer. Just to give you a couple other examples, we can talk more in just a second about DDT. It was a chemical that we used as a pesticide to spray on our fields, to kill insect pests that were eating our crops. And the first thing that we found out about it, actually, was that it caused thinning of bird eggshells. Now, it also has some effects on humans that we'll discuss. But the first thing that we noticed about it was its effects on birds. The bird population started crashing because it makes the eggshells really thin when birds are exposed to it. And then so those eggs would actually crack and break before they were able to hatch. And then, anybody who likes to go fishing here? Yeah, so you may have looked in, whenever you get a state fishing license, they give you the booklet that has all the fishing regulations, and it'll tell you about lakes that you can't eat too many fish from. They'll give you a limit on the amount of fish you can eat, like 1 meal per month or something like that. Well, a lot of that is due to mercury contamination. So mercury occurs in close association with coal. So when we burn it in coal-burning power plants, that mercury goes up into the atmosphere, and then when it rains, it comes back down to Earth, washes into these lakes. And so it eventually finds its way into fish tissues. And so lakes that are downwind of coal-fired power plants often have fish advisories where you can't eat a lot of the fish because they contain mercury. And mercury is a neurotoxin. It affects the way that our brains and our nervous system work. So, so that's a real issue. So a couple of the contaminants that you may hear about. So there's 3 things about contaminants that make them dangerous. And we'll go through each of these separately, so you don't need to write them down. But their persistence, their bioaccumulation, and their biomagnification. So first, thinking about persistence. If we think back to the PCBs in the Alaskan lakes, you can go to sediment samples of lakes in Alaska and find PCBs of all different kinds. This is a graph. Each of these different bars is a different species of PCB, a little different chemical. And you can still find these in the Alaskan lakes, even though, when did we stop making them in the US? Anybody remember when that was? Yeah, in the 70s, right? So these haven't been manufactured for 50 years, but we still find them, right? We still find them out in the environment. So why would contaminants persist in the environment? Why don't they just degrade, decompose, go away? Any thoughts? Say that again?
The water cycle?
So the water cycle, so that's like moving around and bringing them back. Yeah, so that, for instance, keeps them from getting buried underground, right? That they're active in the water cycle. And when we think of a lot of the chemicals in nature, like if we think of like nitrogen, we talked about a nitrogen cycle, right, where it gets moved around to different forms. Yeah.
Well, the ceiling is to do with the half-life, and then if it affects, like with the fish, they're gonna, 2 fish that are infected with PCBs make more fish, and that fish will probably have PCBs in its.
So that's a good point. So with the PCBs in their tissue, it will be in the tissue of their young, right? Yeah, and you know, half-life is an interesting thing. So that's an example of how it might if they weren't getting new PCBs into their system, how it might, over time, levels might get less. But the main point is that they're not part of any of those cycles that we talked about, right? Those biogeochemical cycles. So when phosphorus gets into the environment, it gets taken up by plants. It gets turned into plant tissue. It gets eaten by animals, and animals turn that into their tissue. And they turn them into different molecules and compounds. But these contaminants have never before existed. So there are no processes that break them down because there are no species that have evolved to use them. There are no chemicals that use them as substrates for other reactions. So because these compounds aren't being taken up and transformed into different things, they just kind of sit out there in the environment. They don't get taken up. They just sit there wherever they are, whether they're in the sediment of the lake or in the tissue of a fish. So that's why they persist out there in the environment. All right, what do we mean by bioaccumulate? What does that mean to y'all? The next term is one that you might confuse it with potentially, but bioaccumulate just means that they get into living organisms. And the reason this happens is because they get taken up accidentally, right? So the salmon weren't trying to feed on the PCBs. But PCBs were in the microorganisms in the ocean. They'd absorbed it out of the water. They were in the small fish the salmon fed on, because the small fish ate the microorganisms. So those chemicals are ingested, but again, the species don't have any way to digest or break them down, because if you ingest protein, your body can use that for something. If you ingest carbohydrates, your body can use that for something. But if you ingest PCBs, your body doesn't do anything with that. And so it does the same thing with PCBs that it does with extra energy that it doesn't need to use. It stores that in the body, and the way that it stores that is in fatty tissue, right, where our body stores extra energy. So that's actually another thing you might notice if you read the guide on fishing rules and regulations for North Carolina. It might say, if you do eat fish from some of these polluted lakes, be sure to remove the fatty tissue, right? So like in fish, like the belly meat has a little higher fat content. The meat along the lateral line has a little higher fat content. So they'll recommend trimming the fatty part of the fillet, for instance, before you eat it, right? Okay, so these chemicals, they're in the environment, they persist, they're taken up by living organisms. And then the final piece is that they biomagnify. And this just means that the concentrations increase as we move up the food web, as we move up in trophic level. So this is an example from the North Atlantic. And these are concentrations of PCBs in parts per billion. So we can see that in the plankton, we've got concentrations somewhere between 1 and 3 parts per billion. So those plankton are consumed by small filter-feeding fishes like herring. And the herring have concentrations in their tissues ranging between 6 and 45 parts per billion. So we've increased concentrations by, 2 to 20 times. All right, well, seabirds that feed on this herring, they have concentrations in their tissues of over 3,000 parts per billion. And then way up at the top of the food web in the North Atlantic are porpoises, and they can have concentrations in their tissue on 11 to 17,000 parts per billion. So you can see the actual amount out there in the plankton floating around in the ocean isn't very high, but when we get up to the top of the food web, we're at, almost 10,000 times the concentration that we were at the bottom of the food web. In fact, some porpoises, like killer whales, for instance, Some of them have such high levels of toxins in their tissue that they actually have to be disposed of as toxic waste. So think about that for a moment. So why does that happen? Why are we magnifying the concentration levels as we move up in the food web? What might be going on there? Mm-hmm.
Because the higher up on the food chain you go, the more energy that trophic level needs, and so it has to eat more of that is on the lower trophic level, so it's just accumulating more and more PCBs.
Right, yeah, exactly. So if we go back to our good old pyramid of numbers, to support a small amount of biomass at the top of our food web, we need a lot of biomass at the bottom, right? And so the energy from here all gets moved up to here. But as we move from level to level, we lose the energy, right? Because it's metabolized. So the herring eats the plankton. It burns up almost all that energy. But it doesn't burn up any of the toxins. So the energy is going to go either get turned into biomass, it's going to be released through its metabolism, but all of the toxins are going to keep accumulating. So yeah, when we get to the top of the pyramid of numbers, all of the contaminants that have been ingested at the bottom of this food web are going to be concentrated into the tissues of the consumers at the top of the food web. And so that's why we have these super high levels of toxins at the top of the food web. Okay, so those three factors are really what are problematic with regard to pollutants. So again, one of the first examples of this had to do with DDT. Again, it was a pesticide that was sprayed on fields. We've got a timeline going from the 60s to the 80s, and then a couple different y-axes here, but this red line is the amount of residue of, this is actually a breakdown product of DDT. It breaks down just a little bit. This is the amount of residue in eagle egg. Quite a bit after DDT was banned in the 1970s. So in this case, it was probably the active spraying, right, that got it into them. Because even though this was still out in the environment, the amount in eagle eggs had declined. And the mean numbers of young per breeding area was going up. So this is kind of a success story in the sense that a decline in the amount of contaminants looks like it related to an increase in eagle abundance. But there was something else that happened that might have helped the eagles out. Anybody remember 1973? There was a piece of legislation that came down the pipe. The Clean Water Act was in there, yeah. But there's one piece of legislation that the bald eagles were one of the first species put onto. Probably going to give it away. Yeah, so certainly these other legislation could play a role, right? So like Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, that led to reduced pollution, which was good for them. But the Endangered Species Act came along in 1973. The bald eagle was one of the first species listed on it, and so that probably played a role as well. But suffice to say, there was less DDT in bald eagle eggs by the end of the 70s, and that helped with their recovery as well. So let's talk a little bit about DDT. I think this is an interesting story because it contains some take-home messages that we can apply to other environmental issues. So this is the chemical structure of DDT. So organic chemists, they just like to make stuff. They like to make stuff because they can make stuff. So when DDT was first synthesized in 1873, it didn't really have any notable qualities. Chemists made it. It was this new chemical, but there was really nothing notable about it. It was kind of like, all right, we made this thing, but, you know, let's go make something else now. All right, fast forward to the 1930s, and there's a scientist, Paul Muller, who was trying to find chemicals that would kill agricultural pests. And he was trying all different sorts of chemicals. screening them. He was trying to combat these potato beetles, which could come and really wipe out the potato crop. And, you know, DDT seemed to do a good job of killing these beetles. So a sample was sent to the US in 1942. So what was going on in 1942? World War II was going on. It was one thing that was going on. So at this time, the US military was researching potential pesticides, because one of the worst things about war was how many soldiers died of diseases, you know, that were unrelated to being killed on the battlefield. Simply being killed of diseases was a high risk. And so typhus was a disease that was carried by lice. And that disease had killed 2.5 million soldiers in World War I. So it was a priority of the military to find things that could kill insects. The lice are actually arthropods, no, a different group of arthropods, but a similar thing. So in 1943, DDT showed that it was really good at killing mosquitoes. In fact, better than anything else. It also was good at killing these lice. What it does is it messes with the chitin, the carbohydrate that insects and other arthropods use to make their shells. It messes with that. It makes it so insects can't really build their exoskeletons. So in 1943, DDT was used in Italy during a typhoid outbreak and was extremely effective. It was very good at killing these lice, which were carrying these diseases. And so interestingly enough, World War II was the first war in history where more soldiers died from wounds than from disease. And that's due to a lot of things. Obviously, it wasn't just DDT, it was other things as well. But there were a lot of technological advances which came out of World War II that, you know, were developed for sort of military purposes and then later extended into civilian life. This is a pretty significant event. DDT was really good at killing insects, crustaceans, other arthropods. So in fact, Paul Muller won the Nobel Prize in 1948. And in the citation, it commended him for the discovery of DDT, essentially. It said, DDT is cheap, easily manufactured, and exceedingly stable. A surface treated with DDT maintains its insecticidal properties for a long time, up to several months. So if you sprayed a surface with DDT, it could kill insects that landed on that surface for several months. And then I kind of feel like Bill Nye could have written this. The story of DDT illustrates the often wondrous ways of science when a major discovery has been made. A scientist, working with flies and Colorado beetles, discovers a substance that proves itself effective in the battle against the most serious diseases in the world. So at this point, DDT is riding high. It's like out there during the late night talk show circuit. It's like everybody, like DDT is like superstar, right? And so what was really seen as this incredible new chemical that was making life safer for all of us. It could reduce disease, and it could increase our agricultural production, right? Because we didn't have to worry about these insects that would come and eat the crops. So this is a picture of a truck on a beach in New Jersey, and it's fogging the beach with DDT to kill mosquitoes. And these women right here, if you can see, they're smiling. They're thrilled to be out on this beach as it's being sprayed with DDT because it's completely safe, supposedly, and that'll kill all the mosquitoes. There was even this was from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. You've got like fruits and vegetables singing. You've got you know, cattle, of course, the housewife, you know, DDT is good for me. And they even recommended spraying DDT in cabinets where you kept plates and things, you know, to kill like ants and roaches and stuff like that. So it was like, let's spray this stuff everywhere. All right, well, before too long, people started noticing some of these negative effects. So I mentioned the impacts on birds. So, for instance, people working on farms would notice after a field had been sprayed with DDT that there would be birds dying, that it wasn't just the insects, that it seemed to be bad for other species too. And Rachel Carson at that time was a government scientist who also wrote articles for the popular press. And so she wrote articles about nature, about science. She's pretty well known. And so people started writing letters to her, like describing these things, like describing how these birds were dying after DDT was sprayed. You know, what's going on here? And so she started kind of compiling those letters and doing some research herself. So this is in the late 50s, you know, a little more than a decade after DDT was really incorporated into widespread use. So fast forward, in the 1960s, Rachel Carson publishes a book called Silent Spring, which lays out all this evidence of the negative environmental impacts of DDT, and basically argues that if we keep using these chemicals to this extent, we could have a spring where we don't have insects singing, all the sounds of nature that we're used to. So it was first published actually as a series of articles in the New Yorker magazine. President Kennedy read about that and assembled a commission to look into the problem to see just how serious it was. So there was opposition. The companies that manufactured these pesticides, DDT, pushed back. So an executive of one of these companies wrote, "If man were to faithfully follow the teachings of Miss Carson, we would return again to the Dark Ages, and the insects and diseases and vermin would once again inherit the earth." Kind of like doom and gloom sort of thing, right? This is a pamphlet distributed by the Monsanto company, which made pesticides and now is making several genetically modified crops, so they're kind of seen as like the environmental bad guy a lot. But they published a little flyer titled "The Desolate Year," sort of in contrast to Silent Spring, saying that if we stopped using these pesticides, essentially the insects would take over, right? But suffice to say, after congressional hearings, it's kind of a sad story in the sense that Rachel Carson passed away from cancer before DDT was banned, but her testimony before Congress is really crucial in pushing that legislation through, so that in 1972, a chemical for which a scientist had been awarded the Nobel Prize was banned. Could no longer use it. Now, it's interesting, DDT is advocated for use in certain parts of the world where malaria is endemic and causes high mortality. So malaria still kills over 1 million people annually around the world. So the World Health Organization, for instance, still recommends DDT be used in very limited amounts with very targeted spraying in places where malaria is endemic. But it's kind of a crazy story, right? Some data on DDT. This is in Mexico. So Mexico is a place that still uses it quite a bit. As I mentioned, it's banned in the US, but not everywhere in the world. And you know, the question, how well does DDT work? As far as malaria prevention is concerned, here's a graph going from the late 50s up to the early 90s. And the black plot there are number of cases of malaria. And these blue bars are the number of households where malaria has been sprayed. And I don't know, if you look at those data, do you feel like DDT helps with the fight against malaria? What do y'all think? So year to year, the number of malaria cases, the number of households where DDT has been sprayed. A couple nodding heads. Yeah, so like if you're a public health official, you know, proper use of DDT does seem to decrease it, right? So we see like in the 1970s, there were a fair amount that was sprayed, and then the cases declined, right? Sorry. A lot of households sprayed, fairly low cases. Then, very few households sprayed, what happens? The number of cases goes up again. Then we increase the number of households sprayed, the number declines. Now, I'm not trying to say that the only way to fight malaria is to spray DDT. There are lots of other things to do. But it does help. So this is kind of a conundrum, right? If you're a public health official and you're in a place where there are people dying of malaria, you know, maybe DDT sprayed in the right way is something to do. It's advocated to be sprayed on the walls of houses so that it sticks against the walls, so that when mosquitoes come in to land there and then emerge at night to feed on people, that they'll die. So in some limited capacity, it's still recommended. But what else? What does it do to people, though? So it's been linked to an increase in prevalence of certain cancers. These studies are hard because there's so many factors to look at, but it's been linked to an increase in certain cancers. It's an endocrine disruptor. That is, it mimics certain hormones when it gets into our body and can affect the way that our bodies work systemically. And then folks that are chronically exposed to it, and this was largely folks in the agricultural industry, farm workers, they see evidence of a few things, some neural and psychological effects to the neural system, asthma due to inhalation, and it's also been linked to late onset diabetes, type 2 diabetes. So these are all things that DDT does in addition to killing insects. So the tune has changed a little bit. Instead of everyone singing DDT's praises, they're like, what? We didn't know that. We were singing its praises all along. It's not so good. So I don't know. What are some of the take-home messages of the story of DDT? Any thoughts? Mm-hmm.
Artificially synthesized chemicals should be implemented and they would like clear on what the effects are.
Okay. Yeah, we went all gung-ho, and later on, something that everyone was behind, it turned out, was banned, right? So just some interesting lessons, right? When you see something that seems like the newest thing and the great thing, just, you know, a little skepticism is never a bad thing. And, you know, I think this relates to GMOs a bit, you know, because, like, we haven't found really any major negative impacts of GMOs on human health. But I think because of stories like DDT, people are still a little nervous. They're like, you know, it's kind of new, got a history of, you know, artificial chemicals and things affecting us negatively. I'm not quite sure I want to be eating GMOs, even though I haven't seen a study that necessarily like has the smoking gun of like strong negative effects on human health. So, you know, interesting things to think about. All right, so when we talk about exposure to environmental contaminants in general, there's sort of two different categories. What's the difference in acute exposure and chronic exposure? What's acute exposure? Yeah, exactly. So acute is generally exposure to the high levels of toxins, but for a short period of time. Whereas chronic is exposure to the lower levels, but for a longer period of time. Which of those two do you think is easier to gather data on? Yeah, acute, right? Because, so imagine that I work in a factory that has industrial chemicals in use. And, you know, when I'm 60, I contract a certain variety of cancer, right? And I think, well, maybe the chemicals in that factory played a role. Well, the problem is, there have been a lot of other things going on in my life, too, over those 60 years. And so saying that the cancer is due to that particular chemical is very challenging. You have to do studies with thousands of participants tracked over long periods of time. It's very difficult to untangle effects of all these different things. For instance, mercury exposure. We know a lot about how mercury affects the human body because of something that happened in Japan. There was a company that produced mercury in a town called Minamata, Japan. And the waste went into a river which flowed into a bay. And folks in the nearby villages were eating seafood from that bay, you know, the shellfish, the fishes, all that kind of thing. And incredibly high rates of neurological disorders, especially among young people. It was really sad. And so high exposure to mercury is sometimes called Minamata disease because that acute exposure kind of showed us what mercury actually does to the human body, sadly. So acute exposure is easier to recognize and a lot easier to kind of assign blame to, right? Whereas chronic exposure is harder to detect and diagnose. Kind of like the link between cigarette smoking and cancer. It was a really strong connection once they studied it in the proper way statistically. But until that was done, you know, you could just say that there were other things, which is what the cigarette and the tobacco industry did for a long time, right? So acute exposure, yeah, I think you probably have understood this by now, but it stems from, you know, something that happened, a discrete event, some kind of a spill. Similarly, a lot of what we know about the way that radiation affects the body, we know from the experiences of folks like Pierre and Marie Curie, who were exposed to really high levels of radiation before we knew how dangerous it was. Or the experiences of some of the firefighters who went and tried to contain the Chernobyl explosion in what was then the Soviet Union. So we've learned a lot about the negative impacts of these chemicals and other exposures, sadly, from these acute events. But which do you think is more common, acute or chronic? Chronic, for sure, right? So there are a lot more folks that get exposure to low amounts of mercury than there are that, you know, get those incredibly high levels. So the challenge is to be able to tease this apart, right? To figure out, you know, what are the chemicals that are affecting us negatively, and how much do we have to be worried about? Okay, so I'm going to keep moving, but you can look at the video to finish it up if you need to. A couple more things just to touch on. Endocrine disruptors. You know, I mentioned that DDT behaves like a hormone in the human body. So our endocrine system is incredible, right? It's this hormone-based system where, like, tiny changes in the concentration of chemicals in our body, hormones, can affect all of our bodily systems, right? So when we have pollutants that mimic hormones, they can affect our body in a pretty great degree. Endocrine disruptors, then, are any chemicals that disrupt sort of this hormonal system. And it turns out that a lot of pollutants actually mimic the hormone estrogen, just because of the chemical structure of these organic pollutants. Some of y'all may have heard of BPA. It's a chemical that used to be used in cans, aluminum cans, because it's a good, not aluminum, steel cans, because it's a real good sealant. But BPA is another chemical that mimics estrogen similarly to the way DDT does, PCB does, all kinds of things. So these endocrine disruptors are bad news because tiny amounts of them in our bodies can affect the whole way that our bodies function. So for instance, there are data on like declining sperm count in men over the last 80, 90 years or so, increasing rates of testicular cancer. And there's been some evidence to linking this to exposure to estrogen mimicking pollutants. So, endocrine disruptors may be playing a role here. Again, chronic exposure over a long time. So we have all these things in the environment, and we need to figure out how they're dangerous. So we can use something called risk assessment, and so that allows us to quantify how risky a particular action is. Just to give an example of what this looks like, you don't have to write all this down, but we can look at essentially how likely we are to die of different things. This is a very cheery topic, but we could look at the lifetime odds of dying of cardiovascular disease, about 1 in 4, right? Something that affects a lot of people. Lifetime odds of dying in a motor vehicle accident, about 1 in 88. Dying in a commercial aircraft crash, a lot lower, about 1 in 40,000. And so you look at these different things, and then you think, all right, let's assess these risks. How risky is it to get in a car, right? How risky is it to eat a high-fat diet without any exercise, right? All these different things. And I think like perception of risk is interesting too. Because like you have people that are afraid of flying, but they might not be afraid of like a lack of exercise, you know? But then when you assess really how risky these things are to our life, you know, it kind of puts it in a little bit of perspective here. And maybe it's a control thing. Maybe they're like, I can always start eating healthy and exercising tomorrow. But in the aircraft, like my life is in the pilot's hands, even though it's a pretty safe thing, right? So risk assessment is this idea of using statistical methods to figure out how risky a particular action is. And then the next piece is to evaluate whether we need to eliminate that risk or not. And so with risk management, you look at the pros and the cons of that action. So for instance, yeah, it's risky getting in a car. I still remember, man, when I got my license, I was so scared the first time I drove. I was like hugging the curb on the right side. I was like, I think I might even bumped into the curb a few times. It's scary, right? Think, wow, there's this like giant, huge piece of metal like that's coming at me at like 30 miles an hour, which is fast when you're a little kid. And I'm just like, my gosh, like that's a big responsibility, right? But then we get used to it all the time, and our lifestyle would be very difficult if we just didn't get in a motor vehicle at all. Oh, it's risky, right? There's risk associated with it. So risk management, we say, yeah, we're going to put speed limits up, we're going to regulate traffic, but we're going to let people drive. The final thing I'll mention here, so there's sort of two philosophies to managing risks. I don't know if you can see this. There's the innocent until proven guilty approach, and then there's the precautionary principle approach. And so imagine that we have two chemicals that we're bringing to market. Okay? One of them is hazardous. That's the light blue here. The other is not. It's the purple here. So we've got these two chemicals. So the innocent until proven guilty approach basically says we're going to bring things to market faster with relatively little testing, and then when we find out that there's a problem, we're going to take the thing off the market. The precautionary principle approach, on the other hand, relies on a lot more testing initially. Now, these are two extremes, right? These are just kind of ways of thinking about it. But when you think of, for example, genetically modified organisms, in the US, all along, we've taken the innocent until proven guilty approach. We had no regulations even on labeling of GMOs till a couple of years ago. Whereas Europe, on the other hand, required labeling. Some countries did not even accept shipments of genetically modified grain. So they were taking more the precautionary principle approach, saying, look, we haven't seen any negative impacts yet, but we haven't completely resolved our uncertainty about this. So this is the idea. So with an innocent until proven guilty approach, you're probably going to need to wait until some harm to human health to take things off the market. Whereas the precautionary principle approach is going to try to clear that all out ahead of time with more rigorous testing before things get brought to market. So kind of two philosophies to think about in managing risks. I want to make sure y'all can see that innocent until proven guilty approach, precautionary principle approach. All right. Wow. I'm impressed we got through that. I wasn't sure when the screen wasn't working. But we're actually back on track topic-wise. So we're now back on schedule, which is awesome. So no need to continue at hyperspeed. Any questions or comments? Cool. I'll go ahead and post that review sheet here in the next couple of days. Keep your eye on that. In the meantime, be looking over your notes, and you'll be in good shape for our exam.